The bank manager's smile disappeared the second I said, "I want to close every account I have here." "Not one account. Every account." Her fingers froze over the keyboard. Her eyes darted past me, toward the glass office in the back corner of the lobby. That's when I saw him. My ex-husband. Standing there in his tailored suit, mid-conversation with someone I didn't recognize at first. Then she turned around. His new wife. The woman he left me for when I had nothing. The woman who sent me a Christmas card last year with a photo of their perfect life, in the house I decorated. She looked at me like I was a ghost. No, worse. Like I was a mistake that refused to stay buried. They both stood frozen, watching through the glass as if they were observing some kind of zoo exhibit. And then she did it. She leaned toward him, close enough that her lips almost brushed his ear, and whispered something. One sentence. I couldn't hear it. But I didn't need to. Because the entire lobby felt it. The tellers glanced up. The security guard shifted his weight. Even the elderly man waiting in line turned to stare. The air changed. Thick. Tense. Poisonous. And in that moment, I realized something that hit me like ice water. They thought I came back to beg. They thought I was here to ask for help. To negotiate some sad little alimony adjustment. To play the victim one more time in front of an audience. They had no idea I was about to walk out of that bank with $70 million. If you've ever been underestimated in public, if you've ever walked into a room where people assumed you were less than, if you've ever had someone whisper about you like you couldn't hear it, hit like, hit subscribe, and drop the word undervalued in the comments. Because what I did next didn't just shock them. It shattered them. And you need to see how this ends. Before I tell you how I ended up sitting on $70 million, you need to understand who I was when he left. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't connected. I wasn't impressive on paper. I was the woman holding things together while he was building his future. When we were married, I was the one working double shifts at a hospital receptionist job I hated, handling bills that kept multiplying, cutting corners on groceries, skipping birthday dinners and new clothes and vacations so he could chase titles and promotions and networking events at country clubs I'd never been invited to. I believed in stability. In patience. In doing things the slow way, the right way, the responsible way. While he chased status, I learned discipline. While he climbed corporate ladders and collected business cards, I learned how systems actually work. How money moves. How institutions operate. How the invisible infrastructure of wealth is built, brick by boring brick. I read. I listened. I watched. Not because I had some grand plan. Not because I was secretly plotting revenge. But because I was curious, and I had time, and I refused to let my brain go numb just because my life felt small. I took free online courses in finance. I read annual reports from companies I'd never invest in, just to understand how they talked about money. I learned the language of tax codes, asset protection, corporate structures. Not for me. For us. For the future I thought we were building together. And here's the part people miss, the part nobody talks about when they tell stories like this. I never stopped growing just because I stayed quiet. I never stopped learning just because no one was watching. I never stopped becoming someone just because he stopped seeing me. Because that's what happens when you're underestimated for long enough. You stop performing. You stop explaining. You stop trying to prove anything to anyone. And you start moving in silence. By the time he left, by the time he walked out with his designer luggage and his new girlfriend and his patronizing speech about needing more and growing apart, I had built something he never saw coming. Not a business. Not a career. Not some revenge plot. I had built a mind that understood exactly how the world worked. And more importantly, I had built the patience to wait for the right moment to use it. See, when you're invisible for that long, you learn things that people in the spotlight never notice. You see the cracks, the loopholes, the quiet opportunities that only appear when no one thinks you're looking. And I was looking. Every single day. So when my aunt passed away, when I inherited a trust fund I didn't even know existed, most people would have celebrated. Most people would have gone shopping, bought a car, taken a trip, posted about it. I did none of those things. Instead, I did what I'd been preparing to do for years without even knowing it. I made that money work. Quietly. Carefully. Strategically. I diversified. I invested in markets people were sleeping on. I found undervalued assets that institutional investors overlooked because they were too small, too boring, too unsexy for the headlines. I turned $400,000 into $4 million. Then $4 million into 14. Then 14 into 70. All while he was out there, living his so-called upgraded life, posting photos with her at charity galas, pretending he was self-made, pretending he built everything himself. And the whole time, I stayed quiet. I didn't announce anything. I didn't update my social media. I didn't tell old friends. I didn't gloat. Because I knew something he didn't. The real power move isn't showing people what you have. It's showing them what they lost. And that moment in the bank when they both stared at me like I was some pathetic ghost from the past, that was the moment I'd been quietly preparing for without even realizing it. Not for revenge. For proof. Proof that the woman they dismissed, the woman they erased, the woman they whispered about, was never the problem. She was the power they were too blind to see. If this already sounds familiar, stay with me, because what happens next is the part that changes everything. And if you've ever been the person doing the unseen work while someone else took the credit, if you've ever been the one holding it all together while someone else collected the applause, if you've ever been told you weren't ambitious enough, strategic enough, impressive enough, tap like and comment, I know this feeling. Because this story isn't just mine. It's yours too. Our divorce didn't come with screaming or slammed doors. No lawyers fighting over furniture in some cramped conference room. No public drama splashed across social media. No friends forced to pick sides at dinner parties. Just paperwork. Polite conversations over coffee that tasted like nothing. And the quiet, unspoken understanding that I no longer fit the version of life he wanted to show the world. He said we were growing in different directions. That he needed someone who matched where he was headed. Someone who understood his ambitions. Someone who could keep up with the pace of his new life, his new circles, his new expectations. He never said I wasn't good enough. He was too smart for that. Instead, he said things like, you deserve someone who appreciates the life you want, and, I don't want to hold you back from finding your own path. As if he was doing me a favor. As if leaving me was an act of kindness. I didn't argue. I didn't cry in front of him. I didn't beg him to remember who we used to be or remind him of all the years I carried us when he had nothing. I signed the papers with a steady hand and walked away with my dignity intact. And everyone thought that was strength. My friends said I handled it with grace. My family said I was mature. Even his family, the ones who stopped calling after the ink dried, said I made it easy. Easy. That word haunted me for months. Because the truth is, it wasn't easy. It was survival. I made it look easy because the alternative was falling apart in front of people who were already writing me off as the woman who got left behind. And I refused to give them that story. So I smiled. I stayed composed. I said all the right things about moving forward and finding peace and wishing him well. And people believed it. People assumed that was the end of my story. That I stayed behind, quietly rebuilding some small, simple life while he moved forward into bigger houses, better zip codes, shinier everything. They assumed I became one of those women you see at the grocery store, pushing a cart alone, looking a little tired, a little forgotten, a little stuck in the past. They assumed I was fine with it. But what they couldn't see, what nobody saw, was this. I didn't lose direction when he left. I lost an audience. And losing an audience is the most liberating thing that can happen to you. Because when no one's watching, you stop performing. You stop pretending. You stop shaping yourself into the version of you that makes other people comfortable. When he left, I didn't shrink. I expanded into the space he used to take up. I stopped asking permission. I stopped second-guessing. I stopped waiting for approval that was never going to come. I started making decisions based on what I wanted, not what looked right. I started investing in things that scared me. I started taking risks I would have talked myself out of if I still had someone telling me to be careful, or think it through, or maybe wait. I stopped living like someone who needed to be chosen. And I started living like someone who had already chosen herself. So while he was out there, curating his perfect life with his perfect new wife in their perfect new house, posting perfect photos that got hundreds of likes from people who didn't actually know him, I was in my small apartment, sitting at my laptop at 2 a.m, learning how to read market trends and restructure portfolios and identify undervalued assets that nobody else was paying attention to. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't trying to win him back or make him regret anything. I was just trying to build something that couldn't be taken from me. Something that didn't need his name attached to it. Something that existed because I made it exist. And slowly, quietly, without anyone noticing, I started winning. Not in ways that showed up on Instagram. Not in ways that impressed people at parties. But in ways that compounded. In ways that built foundations. In ways that turned $400,000 into millions, then tens of millions, while everyone who knew me still thought I was just getting by. People assumed the divorce broke me. But the truth is, it freed me. It freed me to become the version of myself I never had permission to be when I was busy being his wife. And that version? She didn't need his validation. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need him to see her. Because she could finally see herself. If you've ever been written off because you didn't fit someone else's upgrade, if you've ever been told you weren't enough for the life someone else wanted, if you've ever walked away from something that looked like loss but felt like freedom, comment, still standing. And stay with me, because this is where the story turns. This is where everything they assumed about me gets shattered. After the divorce, I disappeared from the story people thought they knew. No updates on social media. No glow-up posts with new clothes and new confidence. No dramatic comeback tour where I showed up at mutual friends' events looking different, acting different, proving something. I didn't chase attention. I chased understanding. While everyone assumed I was starting over, struggling to find myself, maybe dating again, maybe taking some time to heal, I was starting correctly. I was building a foundation no one could see. I lived below my means, even when I didn't have to anymore. I kept the same modest apartment. Drove the same reliable car. Shopped at the same grocery store. Wore the same rotation of simple clothes that didn't make statements. People who ran into me assumed I was stuck. They'd give me that look. That soft, pitying smile that said, "Oh, you're still here." I'd smile back. Ask about their lives. Let them talk. Let them assume. Because while they were talking, I was learning. I learned how money actually moves, not how it's talked about at dinner parties where everyone pretends to understand markets they've never studied. I learned the difference between looking wealthy and being wealthy. I learned that real power doesn't wear logos. I paid attention to patterns. Timing. Leverage. Risk. I studied how institutional investors think. How they move. Where they hesitate. Where they pounce. I learned to read balance sheets the way some people read novels, finding the story hidden in the numbers, the truth buried in footnotes, the opportunities disguised as problems. Most nights, my life looked boring from the outside. Deeply, profoundly boring. Early mornings at my desk with coffee that went cold while I analyzed markets before they opened. Long hours researching companies nobody had heard of, in industries that didn't make headlines, solving problems that weren't sexy enough for venture capital but were profitable enough to matter. Reinvesting profits instead of spending them. Saying no to dinners, trips, purchases, experiences that would have felt good in the moment but would have slowed down the compounding. Saying no when it would have felt so good to say yes. To prove I was fine. To show I'd moved on. To flash something that made people stop underestimating me. But I didn't. Because here's the truth people don't like to hear, the truth that doesn't fit into motivational quotes or highlight reels. Success doesn't announce itself while it's being built. It doesn't post updates. It doesn't celebrate small wins publicly. It stays quiet. It stays patient. It stays invisible. And it lets people underestimate you on purpose. Because underestimation is a gift. It's permission to work without pressure. To fail without audience. To experiment without judgment. When people expect nothing from you, you can build anything. Years passed. 1 year. 2. Then 5. People stopped asking what I was doing. They stopped checking in. Stopped inviting me to things. Stopped wondering if I was okay. They assumed my story had already peaked, that the most interesting thing about me was already in the past, that I was just one of those people who fade quietly into the background of everyone else's more exciting lives. I let them. I let them forget me. I let them write me off. I let them move on. Because the less they noticed me, the more freedom I had to grow without interference, without questions, without people projecting their limitations onto my possibilities. I wasn't hiding. I was just working. Quietly. Consistently. Relentlessly. Turning thousands into tens of thousands. Tens of thousands into hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of thousands into millions. Reinvesting. Compounding. Repeating. No one knew. Not my family. Not my old friends. Not even the financial advisors I eventually hired, because I split my assets across multiple firms so no single person could see the full picture. I stayed small in everyone's story. Including his. I knew he'd remarried. I'd seen the photos, the announcements, the carefully curated life he was broadcasting to anyone who'd look. I didn't react. I didn't comment. I didn't care. Or at least, I told myself I didn't. But then something happened. Something small. Something most people would have ignored. I got a message. From her. His new wife. It was short. Polite on the surface. But underneath, it was dripping with something else. Pity. She'd heard I was doing okay. She hoped I'd found peace. She wanted me to know there were no hard feelings, and that she understood how difficult it must have been. As if I needed her understanding. As if I needed her permission to be okay. As if my life required her footnote to be complete. And something inside me, something I'd kept locked down for years, flipped. Not anger. Not revenge. Just clarity. Crystal clear, ice-cold clarity. I realized they still thought of me as the before picture. The cautionary tale. The woman who got left behind. And I decided, in that moment, that it was time to close that chapter. Not for them. For me. So I called the bank. And by the time I finally walked back into that lobby, into their world, into the story they thought they'd finished writing, I wasn't there to reconnect. I wasn't there to explain myself or justify anything or prove I was fine. I was there because I'd made a decision. A decision that had been building quietly for years. A decision that would force them to see exactly what they'd underestimated. If you've ever built something quietly while the world looked the other way, if you've ever worked in silence while people assumed you were stuck, if you've ever let people underestimate you because you knew the truth would speak louder than any explanation, comment silent work. And stay with me, because the moment they noticed me again, the moment I stopped being invisible, is where everything exploded. I didn't go back to that bank looking for trouble. I went in the same way I always had, the same way I'd gone in dozens of times over the years when my life was smaller, quieter, unnoticed. Quiet. Focused. Invisible. Same plain clothes. A simple navy cardigan over a white shirt. Jeans that fit but didn't flatter. Minimal makeup. Hair pulled back. Nothing that said, "Look at me." Everything that said, "I don't need you to." Same calm demeanor. Polite nod to the security guard. Patient wait in line. No urgency. No performance. Same woman at the counter who'd helped me before, who'd never once questioned my worth, never once made me feel like I needed to prove I belonged there. I handed her my ID. Told her what I needed. And then I felt it. That shift in the room when someone looks at you and decides, in half a second, that you don't belong. It's not loud. It's not obvious. But if you've ever felt it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The temperature drops. The air gets thicker. Your skin prickles. You become hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every pair of eyes that might be turning toward you. I saw her first. His wife. Standing near the glass office in the back, waiting while he spoke with someone, probably a private banker, someone important enough to meet in a closed room instead of at a desk on the floor. Perfect posture. Tailored cream blazer. Statement necklace that caught the light. Hair that moved like it had been professionally styled that morning. Polished smile. The kind that never reaches the eyes. The kind that's designed to look warm in photos but feels cold in person. She glanced at me. Just a glance. Casual. Passing. But then she stopped. Her eyes caught on me for a beat too long. Recognition flickered across her face. Not happy recognition. Not surprise. Something else. Something that looked like inconvenience. She turned back toward him, leaned in close, too close for a public space, and whispered something I wasn't meant to hear. Her lips barely moved. But I saw his reaction. He turned. Looked at me. And for a split second, something human crossed his face. Maybe discomfort. Maybe guilt. Maybe just the awkwardness of seeing someone you used to love in a context that no longer includes them. But then it passed. And he smiled. Not at me. At her. That smile told me everything. Not who they were becoming. Who they had already decided I was. I was the past. The mistake. The rough draft they'd revised into something better. I was the woman who didn't fit. Who didn't evolve. Who stayed stuck while they leveled up. And in that smile, in the way he looked at her and not at me, I understood that he'd already told her the story. The story where I was small. Where I was limited. Where I was the reason things didn't work, the weight he had to shed to finally become himself. I stood there holding my paperwork, feeling the eyes of other customers starting to drift toward me, feeling the teller slow down her typing like she could sense something happening but couldn't see it yet. The air around me changed. Thickened. Like my presence embarrassed them. Like I was a stain on their carefully curated afternoon, a reminder of something messy and unfinished that they'd worked hard to forget. Like I was supposed to know better than to exist in the same space as their upgraded life. And then she spoke. Not loud. Not cruel enough to cause a scene or draw attention from the staff. Just sharp enough to cut. She walked toward me. Slowly. Deliberately. Stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral that probably had a French name I wouldn't recognize. And she said, with a smile that looked like sympathy but felt like condescension, "I didn't know you still banked here." 4 words. That's all it took. I didn't know you still banked here. Translation: I assumed you'd moved on to something smaller. Somewhere more appropriate for someone like you. Somewhere that matched your diminished circumstances. Translation: you don't belong in the same financial institution as us anymore. Translation: why are you still here? She didn't wait for me to respond. She just gave me that smile again, that practiced, polished, ice-cold smile, and turned back toward him. And he, the man who'd once promised to build a life with me, who'd once held my hand through my mother's funeral, who'd once told me I was the only person who really understood him, said nothing. He didn't defend me. He didn't correct her. He didn't acknowledge me at all. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, nodding at whatever the banker was saying, pretending I wasn't 10 feet away, pretending this wasn't happening. And that was the moment I understood. I wasn't being ignored anymore. I was being dismissed. Erased. Rewritten out of the story they were telling about themselves. And they wanted me to know it. They wanted me to feel it. They wanted me to shrink, apologize for existing, quietly finish whatever small business I had and disappear back into whatever forgettable life they'd imagined for me. But here's what they didn't know. Here's what nobody in that lobby knew. I wasn't there to be small anymore. I was there to close $70 million worth of accounts. And I was about to make sure everyone in that building, especially them, knew exactly what they'd underestimated. If you've ever watched someone rewrite your value right in front of you, if you've ever stood in a room where people looked through you like you were nothing, if you've ever been dismissed by someone who used to know your worth, comment, "I saw it." And don't blink, because what I decided to do next is where the power shifts. This is where quiet becomes loud. This is where invisible becomes unforgettable. I didn't respond. I didn't defend myself. I didn't correct her or explain anything about my life, my circumstances, or the fact that she had absolutely no idea who she was talking to. I didn't say, "Actually, I'm doing better than you think." I didn't say, "You have no right to speak to me that way." I didn't say anything at all. Because I've learned something over the years, something that only comes from being underestimated enough times that you stop trying to correct it. People who decide your worth without knowing your story aren't interested in the truth. They're not curious. They're not open. They're not waiting to be proven wrong. They're interested in feeling superior. In maintaining the version of reality where they're winning and you're not. Where they upgraded and you stayed behind. where their choices were right and yours were wrong. And nothing you say in that moment, no matter how true, no matter how powerful, will change their mind. Because they don't want to see you. They want to see the story they've already written about you. So I smiled politely. Not a warm smile. Not a fake smile. Just the kind of smile you give a stranger when you're ending a conversation you never wanted to have in the first place. I turned back to the teller, who was watching the exchange with careful, professional neutrality, the kind bank employees are trained to maintain when customers create uncomfortable moments. I finished my transaction. Collected my receipt. Thanked her quietly. And walked out like nothing had happened. Head up. Steps even. Breathing steady. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me rattled, hurt, or thrown off balance. I walked through that lobby like I had every right to be there. Because I did. But the moment the heavy glass doors closed behind me, the moment the air-conditioned silence of the bank gave way to the heat and noise of the parking lot, I knew one thing for certain. I was done. Done doing business in a place that tolerated disrespect. Done allowing my money, my accounts, my financial presence to support an institution where people like her could stand in the lobby and speak to people like me as if we were less than. I didn't need an argument. I didn't need a confrontation. I didn't need her to apologize or him to defend me or anyone to validate that what just happened was wrong. I needed distance. Distance backed by action. Real action. Irreversible action. The kind of action that doesn't announce itself, doesn't make noise, doesn't seek approval. The kind that simply happens, and then people have to deal with the consequences. By the time I reached my car, by the time I unlocked the door and sat down in the driver's seat and stared at the steering wheel for a long, silent moment, the decision was already made. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. Not out of some need to hurt them the way they just hurt me. Out of clarity. Crystal clear, ice-cold clarity. Because here's what I understood in that moment, sitting alone in my car in a bank parking lot on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. The most dangerous thing you can do to people who underestimate you isn't to confront them. It isn't to argue with them. It isn't to prove them wrong in the moment. It's to let them keep underestimating you. Let them keep believing the story they've told themselves. Let them keep thinking you're small, stuck, irrelevant, forgettable. Right up until the moment it costs them something real. Something they can't ignore. Something they can't undo. I didn't pull out my phone and call the bank manager immediately. I didn't march back inside and demand to speak to someone in charge. I didn't post about it online or text my friends or vent to anyone who would listen. I sat there. Quiet. Thinking. Planning. And then I drove home. Calmly. Carefully. Like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Because when I got home, when I walked into my small apartment that nobody knew held the passwords and account numbers to $70 million in assets, I didn't hesitate. I opened my laptop. Pulled up my files. And I started making calls. Not emotional calls. Not angry calls. Professional calls. Strategic calls. Calls to my financial advisors. Calls to my accountants. Calls to the institutions that held my investments, my trusts, my diversified portfolio that nobody in my old life even knew existed. And I gave them all the same instruction. Move everything. Every account. Every asset. Every dollar that was currently sitting in that bank or connected to that bank or managed by anyone affiliated with that bank. Move it. Liquidate what needs to be liquidated. Transfer what can be transferred. Close what needs to be closed. I want nothing left there. Not a single penny. And I want it done this week. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. Because when you have $70 million, people don't ask why. They ask where you want it moved to. And then they make it happen. By the end of that afternoon, I'd set in motion something that would take 3 days to complete but would echo for much longer. Something quiet. Something powerful. Something that would force them to finally see me. Not as I was. As I am. If you believe the strongest move is the one no one sees coming, if you've ever made a decision in silence that changed everything, if you know that real power doesn't need to announce itself, it just moves, comment silent power. And stay with me, because the next step, the moment I walked back into that bank to finalize everything, is when quiet resolve turned into something they couldn't ignore. Something they couldn't dismiss. Something that made every assumption they'd ever made about me shatter in front of their eyes. I didn't rush. I didn't storm back inside that same afternoon, flushed with emotion, demanding to speak to a manager. I didn't send an angry email at midnight, the kind written in all caps with too many exclamation points that makes you look unhinged instead of powerful. I didn't make a dramatic call threatening to take my business elsewhere unless someone apologized. I went home. Made coffee. Sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and my files and my years of carefully organized financial records. And I handled it the way I handle everything that matters. Calm. Documented. Precise. No emotion in my voice. No urgency in my movements. Just clarity. Cold, unshakable clarity. I called my financial advisor first. A woman I'd been working with for 3 years, someone who knew the size of my portfolio, who understood how I thought, who'd helped me structure things in ways that protected growth and minimized exposure. She answered on the second ring. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I said, I need to close every account I have with that bank. Every single one. And I need it done this week. There was a pause on the line. A long pause. The kind of pause that happens when someone is recalculating everything they thought they knew about a situation. She asked if I was sure. Not in a patronizing way. In a professional way. Because moving $70 million out of a financial institution isn't something you do lightly. It has consequences. Tax implications. Logistical complexity. It requires multiple approvals, multiple signatures, multiple confirmations that this is really what you want to do. I told her I was sure. And then I told her something else. I told her to schedule the appointment in person. Not over the phone. Not through electronic transfers that could be processed quietly in the background. In person. At the branch. With physical paperwork. And I told her to make sure it required executive approval. That part mattered. That part mattered more than anything else. Because for accounts of that size, for withdrawals and closures above a certain threshold, paperwork isn't enough. Signatures from regular branch managers aren't enough. Someone at the top has to sign. Someone senior. Someone with authority. Someone who would be forced to sit across from me, look me in the eye, and process what was happening. Someone who would have to ask why. And I wanted to be there when they did. My advisor hesitated for just a moment, and then I heard her typing, pulling up my accounts, calculating the totals, cross-referencing institutional policies. She said, "This is going to require a meeting with the regional director. Probably the branch president too. They're going to want to understand what's prompting this." I said, "Good. Schedule it." She asked if there was a problem with service, something they could resolve, something that might change my mind. I said, no. Nothing they can resolve. Just schedule it. And she did. 3 days later. Tuesday morning. 10 a.m. Plenty of time for word to travel. Plenty of time for people to start asking questions. Plenty of time for the right people to be in the building when I walked in. I didn't change how I looked. Didn't go shopping for a power suit or expensive heels or jewelry that screamed, I have money now. Didn't upgrade my wardrobe to match the number in my accounts. Didn't get my hair done or practice my posture or rehearse a speech in the mirror. I wanted them to see the same woman they had dismissed. The same plain clothes. The same quiet demeanor. The same unremarkable presence that had allowed them to look past me, look through me, decide I wasn't worth noticing. The only difference was what I was about to do. What I was about to take away. And the fact that this time, they wouldn't be able to ignore it. This time, I wasn't asking for permission. I wasn't explaining myself. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply closing my accounts. All of them. $70 million. Walking out. And there was nothing they could say or do to stop me. Because it was my money. My decision. My power. And when the appointment was confirmed, when I got the email with the date and time and the names of who would be present, I saw it. Right there in the CC line. His name. Not as the primary contact. But copied. Because he worked there. In wealth management. In private banking. In the same division that handled high net worth clients. Clients like me. Clients he never knew existed. And when those accounts started moving, when the alerts started firing, when the regional directors started asking questions about why a client with $70 million was closing everything at once, his name would come up. He would be called in. He would be asked if he knew me. If there was history. If something had happened. And he would have to sit there, in a conference room with his superiors, and explain that yes, he knew me. That I was his ex-wife. That he had no idea I had this kind of money. That he'd had no idea I was even a client. I didn't plan that part. But the universe handed it to me anyway. And I wasn't going to waste it. If you've ever prepared a move in silence while others felt comfortable, if you've ever set something in motion that nobody saw coming, if you've ever waited for the perfect moment to show people exactly what they underestimated, comment, checkmate. Because the next moment, the moment I walked into that conference room and sat down across from people who were about to realize what they'd lost, is where everything unraveled for them. Where disbelief turned to panic. Where dismissal turned to damage control. And where I finally, got to be seen. When I walked back into the bank, nothing looked different. Same marble floors, polished to a mirror shine. Same quiet hum of filtered air and muted conversations. Same confident smiles from staff members greeting customers they recognized, nodding at regulars, maintaining the careful choreography of professional courtesy that expensive institutions are built on. I walked past the teller stations, past the waiting area with its leather chairs and financial magazines nobody actually reads, toward the glass-walled conference room in the back where my appointment was scheduled. The same conference room where, just days earlier, he'd been standing with her, whispering, smiling, looking at me like I was a problem that had already been solved. A woman in a tailored blazer met me at the door. Mid-40s. Polished. Professional. The kind of person who's worked in banking long enough to handle difficult conversations without flinching. She introduced herself as the branch manager. Shook my hand. Invited me to sit. Offered coffee, water, anything I needed. I declined politely and sat down. She sat across from me, opened her tablet, pulled up my file. And that's when I saw it. The exact moment everything changed. Until my name appeared on the screen. The woman across from me stopped mid-sentence. She'd been saying something pleasant, something scripted about how they valued my business and wanted to understand my needs, the kind of language that sounds personal but is designed to buy time while they figure out what's actually happening. But then her eyes hit the numbers. And her voice just stopped. Her eyes moved from the monitor, slowly, almost cautiously, to my face, taking me in with a completely different kind of attention than she'd had 5 seconds earlier. Then back to the screen. Like she needed to confirm what she was seeing. Like maybe she'd clicked on the wrong account. She blinked once. Then twice. Her hand moved to the mouse, scrolling, checking details, cross-referencing something I couldn't see. And then she said, very carefully, in the tone of someone trying not to offend but also trying not to look foolish, "I think there's been a mistake." I told her there wasn't. My voice was calm. Even. No emotion. Just a simple statement of fact. There's no mistake. These are my accounts. And I want them closed. She scrolled again. More slowly this time. Her jaw tightened just slightly, the kind of micro-expression people make when they're recalculating everything they assumed about a situation. She paused on one screen. Then another. And then, without looking at me, she picked up the phone on the desk. Not her cell phone. The desk phone. The one with the direct internal lines. She pressed a button, waited, and said quietly, "Hi, it's Jennifer. I need you in conference room B. Now." She didn't say why. She didn't say my name. She didn't say the number. But I knew. And she knew I knew. That's when the room changed. Not physically. But energetically. The air got heavier. The silence got louder. Because we both understood what was happening now. This wasn't a routine account closure. This wasn't a dissatisfied customer moving their checking account to a credit union because of a fee dispute. This was something else entirely. Within 2 minutes, a man in a suit walked in. Older. Silver hair. Expensive watch. The kind of presence that announces seniority without needing a title. He introduced himself as the regional director. He didn't sit down right away. He stood at the head of the table, looked at the screen the branch manager had turned toward him, and I watched his face do the same thing hers had done. Confusion. Recalculation. Disbelief. He sat down slowly. Folded his hands on the table. And said, very carefully, "Ms." He checked the screen again, making sure he had my name right. "We certainly want to accommodate your request, but I have to ask, is there something we've done to lose your confidence? Is there an issue with service, or?" I cut him off. Not rudely. Just clearly. There's no issue with service. I've simply decided to move my business elsewhere. He leaned forward slightly. I understand. But given the scope of your accounts, I hope you'll allow us the opportunity to address any concerns before making a final decision. We value long-term relationships with our clients, and I've made my decision. 4 words. That's all I gave him. Because I didn't owe him an explanation. I didn't owe him a chance to fix something that wasn't broken. I didn't owe him anything. He sat back. Exchanged a glance with the branch manager. And that's when I saw it. The shift. Because numbers don't care about opinions. They don't care about appearances. They don't care about who you think belongs where, who deserves what, who looks like money and who doesn't. They just tell the truth. And the truth sitting in front of them, displayed across 2 screens in clean, undeniable data, was $70 million about to walk out the door. $70 million that had been sitting quietly in their institution, growing, compounding, generating fees and interest and value, completely unnoticed because the person who owned it looked forgettable. $70 million they were about to lose because someone in their lobby had made me feel small. No speeches. No explanations. No dramatic monologue about how they'd underestimated me or how wrong they'd been or how this was karma or justice or revenge. Just data they couldn't dismiss. Just numbers that spoke louder than I ever could. And in that silence, in that moment where they stared at the screen and then at me and then back at the screen, trying to reconcile the two, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Not the kind you perform. The kind you just have. If you've ever let results speak instead of your mouth, if you've ever walked into a room and let the numbers tell the story, if you've ever watched people realize in real time that they made a very expensive mistake, comment the receipts. And stay right here, because the next reaction, the moment he walked into that conference room and saw me sitting there, is the one they'll never forget. The one that turned disbelief into devastation. The tone shifted immediately. Not gradually. Not politely. Instantly. Voices softened. The regional director, who moments ago had been using his professional but firm voice, the one designed to gently steer difficult clients back toward reasonable decisions, suddenly sounded different. Warmer. More concerned. Almost gentle. Posture changed. He leaned in instead of sitting back. The branch manager closed her tablet, as if the screen was creating a barrier between us that she now wanted removed. They both looked at me with a focus I hadn't received when I walked in. The same people who wouldn't meet my eyes days earlier, who'd let me stand in that lobby feeling dismissed and small and invisible, were suddenly careful with their words. Suddenly interested in my comfort. Suddenly invested in understanding my perspective. And I knew exactly what had changed. Not me. The number. That's when the door opened. And he walked in. My ex-husband. In a navy suit I didn't recognize. Looking older than I remembered, but also more polished. More expensive. More settled into the life he'd built after me. And behind him, moving more slowly, less certain, was his wife. She looked confused. Like she'd been pulled into a meeting she wasn't expecting, told it was urgent but not told why. Her eyes scanned the room, landed on me, and something flickered across her face. Recognition. Then something else. Uncertainty. He looked unsettled. Not panicked. But definitely not comfortable. His eyes moved from me to the regional director to the numbers still visible on the screen that was angled just enough for him to catch a partial view. He cleared his throat. Asked, in a voice that was trying to sound casual but came out strained, "What's going on? Jennifer said you needed me in here?" The regional director gestured toward the empty chairs. "Please, sit. We're just working through some account details with Ms." He glanced at me, and I could see him deciding in real time how to refer to me. My ex-husband filled the silence. "I know who she is." His voice was flat. Not cruel. Just factual. He sat down slowly. His wife sat next to him, her hands folded in her lap, her confusion turning into something that looked like concern. The regional director looked uncomfortable now, caught between client confidentiality and the fact that my ex-husband clearly had some connection to this situation. He looked at me. I nodded. Permission to speak. Ms. Anderson has requested to close her accounts with us. All of them. We're trying to understand if there's anything we can do to. My ex-husband interrupted. All of them? He said it like he was clarifying. Like maybe he'd misheard. I answered before anyone else could. Yes. All of them. He laughed. Not a real laugh. Not because it was funny. Because he still didn't understand. Because in his mind, I was still the woman he'd left behind, the one working double shifts, clipping coupons, driving a 10-year-old car. The one who had accounts, sure, but small ones. Modest ones. Unremarkable ones. He said, half to me, half to the room. Why? What's the issue? They charge you some fee you didn't like? And that's when the regional director made a decision. He turned the screen. Just slightly. Just enough. So my ex-husband could see. The full view. The complete picture. Every account. Every balance. Every asset under management. The total at the bottom. In bold. Undeniable. The smile faded from his face so fast it was like watching someone get slapped. His eyes went wide. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked at the screen. Then at me. Then back at the screen. Like he was waiting for someone to tell him this was a mistake, a glitch, a clerical error that would be corrected and laughed about later. His wife leaned forward, trying to see what he was looking at. And when she saw it, when the number registered, she went completely quiet. All the polished confidence. All the casual superiority. All the certainty that she knew exactly who I was and where I belonged. Gone. The room was silent for what felt like a full minute but was probably only 10 seconds. And then, for the first time since I'd walked back into this bank, I spoke plainly. Not emotionally. Not defensively. Not with the shaking voice of someone who's been holding everything in and finally gets to release it. Just clearly. Calmly. With the kind of certainty that comes from knowing you're right. I said, I'm not leaving because of the service. The accounts have been managed well. The returns have been fine. I paused. Looked at him. Then at her. Then at the regional director. I'm leaving because of respect. The regional director started to speak, started to say something about how they valued all their clients equally, but I held up a hand. Not aggressively. Just enough to ask for space to finish. A few days ago, I stood in your lobby and was spoken to in a way that made it clear I wasn't valued here. I was dismissed. I was treated like I didn't belong. I looked directly at his wife now. You assumed you knew my story. You assumed you knew my worth. And you made sure I felt that assumption. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. I continued. And when that happened, I gestured toward my ex-husband, stood there and said nothing. Did nothing. Allowed it. I turned back to the regional director. Silence in the face of disrespect is still a choice. And you, as an institution, made yours. You allowed your clients to be treated that way in your space. And I'm choosing not to continue doing business somewhere that allows that. The regional director looked stricken. He started to apologize, to explain, to promise it would never happen again, to offer some kind of remedy. But I shook my head. This isn't a negotiation. I'm not asking for an apology or a discount or some VIP treatment to make up for it. I'm simply closing my accounts and moving on. I looked at my ex-husband one last time. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically. But diminished. Like he was suddenly realizing what he'd never known. What he'd never seen. What he'd underestimated and walked away from and dismissed as irrelevant. And the weight of that realization was visible on his face. I said, quietly, just to him, you don't need to raise your voice when the truth is standing right in front of everyone. And then I turned back to the branch manager. Can we finish the paperwork now? If you've ever been heard only when it mattered to them, if you've ever watched someone realize your value only after they lost access to it, if you've ever delivered the truth calmly while everyone else was still catching up, comment, too late. Because the final move hadn't even been made yet. The real impact was still coming. And it would echo long after I walked out of that building. I didn't wait for an apology. I didn't sit there expecting someone to find the right words, the perfect explanation that would somehow undo what had already been done. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't need to understand why she thought it was okay to speak to me that way, or why he thought it was acceptable to stand there and let it happen, or why this institution thought respect was optional depending on what someone looked like when they walked through the door. And I didn't give them a chance to fix it. Because some things can't be fixed. Some things can only be walked away from. The documents were placed in front of me. The branch manager slid them across the table with hands that were steady but careful, like she was handling something fragile, something that could shatter if mishandled. Page after page. Account closure forms. Liability waivers. Tax documentation. Transfer authorizations. Each one tied to an account they never thought I'd touch. Accounts that had been sitting quietly in their system, generating value, compounding interest, creating quarterly reports that someone in some office had been reviewing without ever wondering who I was or how I'd built this. I picked up the pen they offered. A heavy one. The expensive kind banks keep in conference rooms for important signatures. And I signed slowly. Not out of hesitation. Not because I was reconsidering. Out of certainty. Because I wanted to feel every single stroke. Every letter of my name. Every account number. Every irreversible decision being made permanent. With every signature, something shifted in the room. Not just money. Power. The kind of power that doesn't announce itself or make demands. The kind that simply moves, and everyone else has to adjust around it. I could feel them watching me. The regional director, sitting stiffly, his hands folded on the table, his jaw tight. The branch manager, her eyes moving between the documents and my face, like she was witnessing something historic and terrible at the same time. My ex-husband, frozen in his chair, staring at the table, unable to look at me, unable to look away from what was happening. His wife, pale now, her polished composure cracked, her hands gripping the edge of her chair like she needed something solid to hold on to. No one spoke. No raised voices. No dramatic last words. No speeches about karma or justice or how they should have seen this coming. Just the sound of a pen moving across paper. The quiet rustle of pages being turned. The soft click of documents being stacked and aligned. And the weight of $70 million being reassigned, redirected, removed from this place and everyone in it. When I signed the last page, I set the pen down carefully. Slid the documents back across the table. The branch manager took them with both hands, like they were heavier than paper should be. She said, quietly, "This will take 3 to 5 business days to process fully." I nodded. "That's fine." She hesitated, then added, "If you change your mind at any point during that window, we can." "I won't." 2 words. Calm. Final. She nodded. Didn't push. The regional director stood up first, extending his hand out of reflex, out of professional habit, even though everything about this moment had gone far beyond professional courtesy. I shook it. Not warmly. Not coldly. Just neutrally. He said, "We're sorry to lose your business." I said, "I'm sure you are." And I meant it. Not as an insult. Just as a fact. They were sorry. Now. When it cost them something. When the numbers made it impossible to ignore what they'd lost. But they hadn't been sorry 3 days ago. When I stood up, no one tried to stop me. No one offered one last pitch, one last chance to reconsider, one last incentive to stay. Because they finally understood what was happening. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with better communication. This was a decision. Made. Done. Irreversible. I gathered my things. My purse. My phone. My copy of the paperwork. I thanked them politely. Not sarcastically. Not coldly. Just with the same baseline courtesy I'd give to anyone who'd completed a transaction for me. Because this wasn't personal anymore. It was just business. I turned toward the door. Opened it myself before anyone could rush to do it for me. And walked out the same way I'd always walked in. Head up. Steps even. Breathing steady. Same plain clothes. Same quiet presence. Same woman. Only this time, I wasn't invisible anymore. This time, every person in that lobby, every staff member who glanced up as I passed, every client waiting in line, could feel it. Not because I looked different. Not because I acted different. But because the energy in that building had fundamentally changed. Because everyone who mattered now knew. The woman they'd overlooked, dismissed, underestimated, ignored, had just walked out with $70 million. And she wasn't coming back. I pushed through the glass doors. Felt the cold air hit my face. Walked to my car without looking back. Got in. Closed the door. And sat there for a moment in complete silence. Not crying. Not celebrating. Just breathing. Feeling the weight of what I'd just done settle into my bones. And then I started the engine. And I drove away. From that bank. From that chapter. From every assumption anyone had ever made about who I was supposed to be. If you've ever closed a chapter without needing permission, if you've ever walked away from something that no longer served you without waiting for anyone to understand, if you've ever made a decision so final that it changed everything, comment, done. And stay with me, because what happened after I left, what unfolded in the days and weeks that followed, was even more telling. Because the real story wasn't what I took with me. It was what I left behind. I didn't hear about the fallout right away. I didn't need to. I wasn't waiting by my phone for updates or checking in with people who still had connections to that world. I went home. Made dinner. Went to bed early. Slept better than I had in weeks. Because I'd done what I needed to do. And whatever happened next wasn't my responsibility anymore. But in places like that, in institutions built on reputation and relationships and the careful management of high-net-worth clients, news moves quietly at first. Whispers in hallways. Closed-door conversations. Carefully worded questions that don't quite say what they mean. Then all at once. It was a colleague who told me. Someone I'd worked with years ago, before the divorce, who still had friends in banking circles. She called me 4 days after I'd signed the papers. She said, "I don't know what you did, but people are talking." I asked what they were saying. She laughed, not cruelly, but with a kind of shocked admiration. She said, "They're saying you just cost someone their career." Meetings got called that weren't on the calendar. Emergency sessions with senior leadership. Conference calls with regional executives who normally only got involved when something was burning. Emails were sent that no one wanted to write. The kind with subject lines like client retention review and account management protocol. The kind that get archived and referenced later when decisions need to be justified. Questions started coming from people much higher up than anyone in that room. People who don't usually care about individual account closures. People who only get involved when the numbers are large enough to matter. When patterns emerge. When liability becomes a concern. Because 70 million doesn't disappear silently. It leaves a hole. Not just in the balance sheet. In the narrative. Suddenly, I wasn't that woman from the lobby anymore. I wasn't the ex-wife. I wasn't the forgettable client who came and went without making an impression. I was a line item on a quarterly report. A problem that needed explaining. A loss that required documentation, justification, root cause analysis. Someone had to answer for it. Multiple someones. I heard his name mentioned more than once. Not in praise. Not in the context of deals he'd closed or relationships he'd built or revenue he'd generated. In concern. In questions about judgment. About oversight. About whether he'd disclosed a conflict of interest. About whether he'd known I was a client and failed to mention it. About whether his personal history with me had created a liability the bank should have been aware of. My colleague said they'd pulled him into a meeting with HR. Not to fire him. Not yet. But to document. To create a paper trail. To make sure that if this became a larger issue, if I decided to escalate, if other clients started asking questions about how high-value customers were treated, they had coverage. And the wife who once dismissed me so casually in that lobby, who leaned in and whispered something designed to make me feel small, was now in the uncomfortable position of explaining why she had. Because someone had asked. Someone in leadership had reviewed the timeline. Had asked who was present. Had asked if there had been any interaction. Any incident. Anything that might explain why a $70 million client had walked away. And her name came up. Not because I'd filed a complaint. Not because I'd called anyone or sent an email or made demands. But because banks protect themselves. They investigate. They document. They make sure they understand what went wrong so they can prevent it from happening again. And in the process of protecting themselves, they exposed her. My colleague said she'd heard that his wife had been asked not to accompany him to the office anymore. Not officially. Not in writing. Just a quiet suggestion. A boundary. A recognition that her presence had created a problem they now had to manage. That's the part people never see. Disrespect feels small in the moment. A whisper. A look. A dismissive comment that takes 3 seconds to deliver and feels like it evaporates into the air as soon as it's spoken. But consequences scale. They ripple. They compound. That 3-second whisper became a $70 million loss. That loss became meetings, reviews, documentation, liability concerns. Those concerns became career implications, reputation damage, strained relationships, uncomfortable conversations that would be referenced for years. All because someone decided I didn't deserve basic respect. All because someone made an assumption based on appearance. All because silence was chosen over decency. I didn't orchestrate that. I didn't call anyone or file anything or demand anyone be punished. I just removed myself from a place that didn't value me. And the system did the rest. Because that's what institutions do when they lose something valuable. They ask why. And sometimes, the answer is uncomfortable. Sometimes, the answer points directly at people who thought they were untouchable. Sometimes, accountability arrives late. But when it does, it arrives heavy. If you've ever watched accountability arrive late but heavy, if you've ever seen consequences catch up to people who thought they'd gotten away with something, if you've ever walked away quietly and let the aftermath speak for itself, comment, "It always does." Because the real win wasn't what they lost. It wasn't the money, the meetings, the career implications, the uncomfortable conversations. The real win was what I chose to build next. With that money. With that freedom. With that clarity about who I was and what I deserved. And that's the part of the story that matters most. Not the revenge. The rebirth. Here's the part that matters most. The part that doesn't get told in revenge stories. The part that's harder to capture in a dramatic moment but means infinitely more. I didn't walk away from that bank feeling victorious. I didn't drive home with my fists in the air, replaying the looks on their faces, savoring the shock, the discomfort, the realization. I walked away feeling responsible. Because somewhere between signing those documents and starting my car, something shifted in me. I realized that what I'd just done, what I'd just proven, came with weight. Real weight. Because money doesn't prove your worth. Not really. Not in any way that matters beyond spreadsheets and account balances. What you do with it does. How you move with it. Who you become because of it. What you build that wouldn't exist without it. I moved my accounts to a bank that treated me like a human being the moment I walked in. Not a private wealth management firm with marble lobbies and exclusive lounges. Just a solid, well-rated institution with fair practices and straightforward service. No assumptions. No judgment based on what I was wearing or who I used to be married to or whether I looked like their idea of a high net worth client. Just respect. The kind of baseline respect that should be standard but somehow isn't. The kind that doesn't require you to prove anything before you receive it. They asked about my goals. Listened to my answers. Offered options without pressure. Treated the process like a partnership instead of a performance. And it felt so fundamentally different that I realized how much I'd been tolerating before. How much disrespect I'd normalized. How low I'd set the bar without even knowing it. But moving my money wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different one. Because then I did something I'd been planning quietly for years. Something I'd been researching, structuring, building in the background while everyone thought I was just getting by. I funded programs for people who were written off too early. Not with a press release. Not with a gala or a ribbon cutting or my name on a building. Just quietly. Strategically. Sustainably. Women who had paused their lives for someone else's ambition. Women who'd worked double shifts while their partners built careers. Women who'd sacrificed their own education, their own dreams, their own trajectories because they believed in partnership, in patience, in doing things the slow way. And then found themselves alone, starting over, told they were too old, too inexperienced, too far behind to catch up. People who were told they didn't fit the picture of success. Who didn't have the right resume, the right connections, the right background. Who'd been underestimated, overlooked, dismissed as unremarkable. The same way I had been. Education. Scholarships for women returning to school after years away. Coding boot camps. Business certifications. Healthcare training. Technical skills that translate to real income, real stability, real agency. Training. Mentorship programs that pair people with industry professionals who actually remember what it's like to start from behind. Who don't just offer advice but open doors. Make introductions. Vouch for people who don't have traditional credentials but have something more important: hunger, discipline, and resilience. Second chances. Seed funding for small businesses that banks won't touch because the numbers are too small or the founder doesn't fit the profile. Microloans with reasonable terms. Grants that don't require repayment but do require accountability, reporting, proof that the money is being used to build something real. Not as charity. As investment. Because I don't believe in rescuing people. I believe in resourcing them. Giving them what they need to rescue themselves. And then getting out of the way. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same system that once dismissed me, that made me feel small and irrelevant and stuck, that treated my presence like an inconvenience and my worth like a question mark, had unknowingly given me the final push to build something that would outlast their titles, their promotions, their carefully curated careers. They thought they were winning when they stood in that lobby and looked past me. They thought they were winning when she whispered and he said nothing. They thought they were ahead. But what they actually did was confirm something I'd suspected for years. That the people in power aren't always the ones who deserve it. That institutions don't protect dignity unless it's profitable. That respect is conditional for too many people. And that someone needed to build something different. So I did. Not out of anger. Not as revenge. As purpose. Because the best response to being underestimated isn't proving people wrong. It's building something so meaningful that their opinion becomes irrelevant. Within a year, the programs I funded had helped 127 people start new careers. 43 women went back to school. 18 started businesses. 66 got certifications that doubled their income. And every single one of them sent me a message, a note, a photo, a story about how it felt to finally be seen, to finally be invested in, to finally have someone believe they were worth the risk. I kept every single one. Not because I need validation. But because they remind me what power is actually for. Not to settle scores. Not to prove points. To lift. To open doors that were closed. To make sure that the next person who gets dismissed in a bank lobby, or passed over for a promotion, or told they don't fit the picture of success, has a path forward that doesn't require them to do it all alone. If you believe success means lifting others once you're standing, if you think power is wasted when it's only used for yourself, if you know that the real victory isn't what you take but what you give, comment, pay it forward. And stay with me, because the final lesson, the one I wish I'd learned sooner, the one that would have saved me years of doubt, is coming next. And it's the most important part of this entire story. Here's what I learned from all of it. From the divorce that looked peaceful but felt like erasure. From the years of building in silence while everyone assumed I was stuck. From the moment I walked into that bank and felt invisible, then walked out and left 70 million reasons for them to remember me. From everything that came after. Your worth doesn't come from titles, or corner offices with glass walls, or invitations to rooms where decisions get made. It doesn't come from the people who decide whether you belong in their world, whether you fit their picture of success, whether you're impressive enough to acknowledge. It comes from what you build when no one is watching. When no one is cheering. When no one is validating your choices or telling you you're on the right path. It comes from the discipline you maintain when it would be easier to quit. From the standards you hold when no one would know if you lowered them. From the work you do in the dark, alone, without audience or applause, because you believe it matters. It comes from how you treat people when you have the upper hand. When you could be dismissive and get away with it. When you could be cold and no one would blame you. When you could use your power to settle scores, to prove points, to make people feel the way they made you feel. But you don't. Because you remember what it felt like. And you refuse to replicate that pain, even when it's justified, even when it would feel good. And it comes from whether you walk away the moment respect disappears. Not after you've tried to fix it. Not after you've explained yourself a dozen times. Not after you've lowered your standards enough to make other people comfortable. The moment. Because staying in places that don't value you, staying with people who don't see you, staying in systems that require you to shrink, isn't patience. It's self-abandonment. Being underestimated didn't break me. It didn't make me bitter or small or determined to prove everyone wrong. It clarified me. It showed me exactly who I no longer needed to explain myself to. Exactly which spaces weren't built for people like me and never would be. Exactly which relationships were conditional and which ones were real. It gave me permission to stop performing. To stop trying to fit. To stop waiting for approval that was never going to come. And in that clarity, in that freedom that comes from no longer caring what people who don't know you think about you, I became someone I actually recognized. Someone I actually liked. Someone I was proud to be. Not because I had money. Not because I'd proven anyone wrong. But because I'd finally chosen myself. Without apology. Without explanation. Without needing anyone's permission. So if someone ever looks down on you because you're quiet, because you don't perform your worth in ways they recognize, because your confidence doesn't look like arrogance, thank them. If someone dismisses you because you don't fit their image of success, because you're building something they can't see yet, because you're not where they think you should be, thank them. If someone underestimates you because your power doesn't announce itself, because your growth happens in private, because you're not interested in proving anything to people who've already decided who you are, thank them. They just told you where not to stay. They just showed you who not to waste your energy explaining yourself to. They just gave you permission to walk away and build something better without them. And that's a gift. Even if it doesn't feel like one in the moment. Even if it hurts. Even if it makes you question yourself. It's still a gift. Because the alternative is staying. Staying small. Staying quiet for the wrong reasons. Staying in rooms that will never see you, with people who will never value you, in systems that were never designed to let you win. And you deserve better than that. Not someday. Not after you prove yourself. Right now. Exactly as you are. If this story hit close to home, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or written off by people who didn't know your full story, share it with someone who needs the reminder. Someone who's building quietly. Someone who's been told they're not enough. Someone who's wondering if walking away makes them a quitter or if staying makes them compliant. Share it with them and tell them, you're not alone, and your worth was never up for debate. Subscribe for more stories about quiet power and earned confidence. About people who didn't shout their way to the top but built their way there. About the kind of strength that doesn't need to be loud to be real. And comment, I know my worth, if you're done letting other people define it. If you're done waiting for permission. If you're done shrinking to make others comfortable. If you're ready to walk away from anything and anyone that doesn't see you and build something that does. Because your story isn't over. It's just beginning. And the best part? You get to write it.